Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of the Midwest Gaming Classic podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garris, panel director of the Midwest Gaming Classic. This episode's guest is Jeremy Parish from the Retronauts podcast and his guest, Brian Clark, to celebrate 25 years of the Virtual Boy's untimely demise with this comprehensive overview of what Nintendo's worst-selling system was all about, all the things it did right, and why it had to die young. If you haven't heard of Jeremy Parish or the Retronauts podcast before this episode, please do yourself a favor and go online and look up Retronauts podcast and Jeremy Parish. Once you find both of those things, you will be treated to a plethora of Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Virtual Boy, Sega Master System, and more talk about everything on those subjects. And it's in-depth and it's really good listening and watching, because you can also watch videos that Jeremy Parish put together about those exact subject matter on his YouTube channel. And you know what? Oh, wait a minute. I just remembered. He also is an author. He has books on the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Virtual Boy, and Super NES. And you can find those books for very reasonable prices, both in regular hardcover and Ultimate Edition hardcover books on limited run games. And you won't be disappointed with those either. I haven't picked any up, but I have seen the Virtual Boy book, and it is chock full of really good photos and information on the Virtual Boy. And you know what? Enough of me talking about the Virtual Boy, Jeremy Parish, and the Retronauts. Why don't we get to the panel?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second presentation of the weekend here at the Midwest Gaming Classic. Glad that all of you are joining us, and this one is rather interesting. We're going from voice acting over to strictly a video game console that is Nintendo's worst-selling console of all time. So you are going to learn all about it from these two wonderful people. Please welcome Jeremy and Brian from Retronauts. So I guess just to start off, kind of give a backstory of the Virtual Boy, because unless they're really hard into video games, which we're at the Midwest Gaming Classic, of course a lot of you are huge video game fans, but for those of you who may not know, what is the Virtual Boy made by Nintendo?
Oh, are you moderating? This is new.
Slightly.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna throw out my notes.
Keep the notes, we'll keep it fluid.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Parish, and this is a Retronauts panel, but this is not Bob Mackey with me. Please introduce yourself.
This is Brian Clark from 1 Million Power, though both of our first names do start with B, I suppose.
And we've actually done a Virtual Boy recording together many years ago at Midwest Gaming Classic, but now I have played the Virtual Boy, all of it. Out of curiosity, who here has played Virtual Boy? All right, who here owns a Virtual Boy? Who here has really played Virtual Boy? I don't mean going to the Blockbuster kiosk and playing Red Alarm for 5 minutes and being like, whoa, or like playing the first level of Wario Land on an emulator. I mean like really sticking your face in that thing and just soaking it up. All right, so you know what's up. You know that, as our MC said, this is the worst selling Nintendo console of all time, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's the worst. I would say it's misunderstood and didn't have a chance to live. So the Virtual Boy launched in 1995 and went away early in 1996. It was not very long for this world. Nintendo sold about 750,000 units worldwide. It just didn't really have a chance to take off. But it was a very interesting piece of technology, sort of a successor to Game Boy, but not really. The sales pitch for this thing was, it was a 3D console without glasses. It was a headset. It was supposed to be like virtual reality, but it really wasn't. And it went through a lot of developmental problems and didn't really turn out the way that I think it was supposed to, that its creators intended for it to turn out. So, despite that, the people who made games for it did a pretty good job of it. And so there are some gems out in there in the library. I don't know if you've been out on the vendor floor, but you will pay a lot of money for those games now, which is very interesting because about 10 years ago you would have paid nothing for those games. But I think the rarity and the kind of, the sort of, I would call it almost a mystique of its broken reputation have made it a very appealing sort of system. So I will say that every 15 minutes we're going to take a break during this panel so that you won't get a headache. But I have some video footage over here that's just going to take us through the library. This has nothing to do with what I'm actually talking about. It's just something for you to look at. Brian, would you like to add anything about what the Virtual Boy is and is all about?
I think you covered it pretty well, but I guess I'll just repeat a quick story I told on our episode back in 2019 with my experience with it when it came out, probably many people's experience when it came out. I was very excited about it. I saved up money for it. I went to a Toys R Us, played it for 5 minutes, and spent my money on something else.
Yeah, it was kind of a tough sell. So I asked, who's played Virtual Boy, who owns one, who actually loves Virtual Boy? All right, you are the few, but the proud, and I salute you. So I'm going to, will we be able to have like a Q&A session later? Excellent. So we'll open up the panel later to talk about why you love Virtual Boy. But in the meantime, we're just going to talk about the technology, the history, and of course the games of Virtual Boy. And you can see over here on the screen, we've got I've captured direct feed footage from a Virtual Boy. This is one of the things I'm hoping we can get to and talk about later, is all the cool stuff that's happened with the system after its demise. And one of those things is that people have figured out ways to get the video feed off of the little lenses and onto televisions. So I put together a complete history, a complete chronology of the series for YouTube, a series called Virtual Boy Works. It's now available in book form at limitedrungames.com if you'd like to go find that. I only have this one copy with me, so I'm not selling them, sorry. My spine can only hold so many books. But it was a really informative, educational experience. I went into it with a lot of assumptions and an open mind, and what I found is that more games than not are actually pretty good, and even some of the bad ones are really, really interesting. One of the things that I think is really great about this system is that it has, if you just take away the 3D element and just look at it basically as the successor to Game Boy, with four shades of monochrome graphics, it has some of the best sprite work ever seen in a video game system. This, maybe Galactic Pinball here is not the best example because it's all like pre-rendered stuff, but you just saw Mario Tennis before, and those are some of the biggest, best animated sprites Nintendo has ever put together for its kind of core characters. We'll see footage from Wario Land later, and that game is just when you just kind of take it away from all the context of the Virtual Boy, it is like Game Boy Wario Land on steroids. It is amazing. The sprites are so big, and there's so much creativity in this game. And it's been trapped for 25 years in this system that hardly anyone owns, that people get headaches when they play, but it deserves better. And I really hope that, over time, Nintendo finally starts releasing some of these games in other formats. They really missed the boat by not putting it on 3DS. They really should have done that, but they didn't. But hopefully someday, they will say, oh, there is a really, really great Wario game and a really interesting sequel to Mario Brothers that no one can really play without buying a $500 console that will break after a month and spending $50 on these cartridges. So there's some treasures to be unearthed by digging into the Virtual Boy.
If anyone from Atlas is listening to this somehow, please re-release Jack Brothers on something somehow.
So when I put together my video series, one of the things I talked about was the Shi Tenno of the Virtual Boy. So if you're familiar with, Japanese cartoons like Sailor Moon, there's always like 4 villains who are kind of like the underbosses of the main boss. The 4 kings of terror, basically, is what that translates to. The 4 heavenly kings. There are 4 games that were only released in Japan that all sell for more than $1,000. They've sold for more than $1,000 for a long time. Now it just keeps going up and up. But unfortunately, in the time since I put together this video series a couple of years ago, there's actually more games that have risen up to that 4-figure club. Jack Brothers is one of those. So there's no longer the Shi Tenno. It's now the Go Tenno. Or it's 5, 6. I don't know how many it is, but the prices keep rising.
And there's been some repros of some of them, hasn't there? Like I'm fairly certain SD Gundam at least got a repro.
Yeah, so this is one of the kind of afterlife things about the Virtual Boy. Some of the games that were released only in Japan have been fan translated, and you can find the ROMs or the patches for those. And some of those have been put onto cartridges and sold by people. But the thing is, no one has ever manufactured Virtual Boy cartridges aftermarket the way people manufacture NES games or Genesis cartridges or Game Boy cartridges. So anytime you get one of those Japanese releases and the fan translation or like some rarity, you have to sacrifice another game. And if you're sacrificing Virtual League Baseball, cool. That's you're putting that cartridge to a better use. But in the sense of game preservation, it does kind of create a sticky situation where in order to quote-unquote preserve games or bring them to a broader audience, you're destroying something. And that's something no one ever likes. I mean, even in this case, the mod that I put together or had assembled for me to do video capture meant that I had to modify original hardware. So that means there's one fewer Virtual Boy out in the world that is, as it was manufactured originally.
And if it's the mod I'm thinking of, it was available for about 5 minutes before the guy started doing.
I was very fortunate to come across this. It just happened to be the right timing. I think they're more readily available now. You can also buy something called the Virtual Boy Consolizer Kit, which essentially takes the Virtual Boy's innards and sticks it in a shell that just plugs into a TV. Whereas the one that I have is still the Virtual Boy, but it has like a video tap. It's called the Virtual Tap that runs out to a television.
So if you were only interested in video output to TV, then Consolizer is probably the way to go then.
But even then you lose something. I mean, I added the color red to this, but I actually recorded all this footage in grayscale because, YouTube's algorithms and video compression kind of destroys red and black and makes it look really bad. So I had to kind of recolorize this. But you're not getting the real Virtual Boy experience with this because for one thing, there's only one image here. There's no 3D. The Virtual Boy actually had 2 built-in screens, and each screen was essentially kind of like a lens that had a different image on it. And so, it's one of those situations where you stick your face in there and each eye sees a different lens, and each eye is seeing a different image. And your brain just kind of says, I can't make sense of what's happening, so I think this is a 3D image. And that's why you get headaches, because your brain is actually being forced to reconcile information that's not real and doesn't make sense to create this combined 3D image. So it's a little tough. But one thing that's actually lost with this technology, the video tab, is that you're seeing kind of like a Game Boy style image where there's 4 shades of monochrome. But there's actually LED lights that create the image inside of the Virtual Boy. So when you actually look at images in the Virtual Boy, you're getting these, the 4 shades of monochrome that the hardware is generating, the video chip, but then the actual video array is able to produce, I think, something like 16 levels of luminosity. So the image is actually a lot more subtle and varied. There's more brightness to it, more depth to it than you can see here, even as a single screen image. And this game, this is a really tough one without the 3D visualization. It's called Red Alarm, and it's a 3D shooter. Very kind of innovative for the time. It used dual sticks or dual D-pads to navigate through 3D space, which no one did at the time in 1995. But when you can't see it in 3D, like these wireframe graphics kind of make no sense. So it's it's a really tough game system to sort of preserve and present for the world and to share with people, because it is this kind of experience that's bound to a screen, you know, two lenses that only you can see when you're playing. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No.
So, Josh, I don't know if you had more questions to nudge us along. No? Okay. All right. Flying without a net here. I don't know what's going to happen, boy. So, Virtual Boy, we'll talk about the history a little bit of it. It actually, you know, I said it launched in 1995, but the technology inside of it goes all the way back to 1985. It was created by a company called Reflection Technologies, as a device called the Scanned Linear Array. And the idea for that was to use spinning mirrors and an LED, like a line of LED lights, to create two separate images for your eyes and create the illusion of 3D. And when I say spinning mirrors, I don't mean just kind of like, you know, kind of casually spinning like those hot dogs on the little tray at 7-Eleven, or, you know, like, you know, when you go to a Brazilian steakhouse, they're kind of spinning the meat. It's not like that. Each of those LED arrays is, I believe, 240 individual LED components tall. That's the vertical resolution of the Game Boy, or a Virtual Boy. But the Virtual Boy's horizontal resolution, I believe, is 384 pixels. But it's only, the LEDs are only 1 pixel wide. So that means that the image, like for each image you see, each frame you see, the mirrors have to spin 384 times. And each time it spins, it sees a different part, like a different arrangement of the LEDs, and projects those to your eye at one tiny fraction of an inch different from the previous impression. So it's basically like burning this image into your eyes so fast that your brain can't keep up. And it does this 384 oscillations 50 times a second. So what is that, like 15,000, 16,000 times per second that these mirrors are spinning and creating this light impression on your eyes? It's kind of amazing technology. And I think that's what appealed to Nintendo, and specifically to designer Gunpei Yokoi, who had previously been known as the key designer behind the Game Boy. And before that, had created things like the original Duck Hunt, which was a light gun that reflected light against a wall. He just came up with all kinds of gadgets, and he created the Game & Watch. And his thing was to look at technologies and say, here is an affordable consumer technology. How can I turn this into fun? How can I turn this into a game? So he looked at, wrist calculator watches and said, how can we make a game out of that? And created Game & Watch, which used that same technology, but to create kind of, graphics doing different things, and you could interface with it, interact with it. He took, some pretty terrible, beaten up, old technology and crammed it together to create Game Boy. And everyone said, this thing is going to flop. It's got a terrible screen, it's got very little power compared to current consoles, and yet it was the best-selling game system of any kind of the 20th century, because it just hit that sweet spot of being super affordable because the technology was so kind of janky and broken in, and just good enough to be fun. And so I think he really saw this technology that RTI had created and said, you know what, we can make a video game experience out of this. And the idea of 3D games had been around for a while. 3D movies were a big thing in the 1950s and 60s, where you put on the red and blue glasses. But here was technology where you didn't have to use those glasses. You could sit down, stick your face in this headset, and you would have 3D. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out like that.
Yeah, it didn't. I guess my story earlier was a really good example of that. I'll also say that I think they had a real missed marketing opportunity to not make the slogan for the Virtual Boy burning images into your eyes so fast that your brain can't keep up. Might have sold a little bit better that way, just for curious people. No, but it's to me like that's like a theme throughout Nintendo's history, like you were saying, right? Like using older technology in newer ways. But to me, like this is the classic one, like the first one that I think of when anyone talks about that concept. Like even though it may have been a failure, like it is, to me, the biggest stretch of like reaching back and saying, what can we do with a technology like this?
Yeah, and this game right here, Vertical Force, is a great example. I don't know if you saw, but it's a vertical shooter, very much in the Star Soldier style. It's made by some of the same people, or now we've moved on to V Tetris. But it made use of that 3D effect for this top-down shooter by allowing you to kind of change your altitude, so you could move your ship essentially further away from your eyes and go underneath panels and objects, and so enemies would attack you on 2 different levels. But I mean, it was pretty much just a really, really fancy Game Boy. And when you look at it in that respect, wow, this is like a crazy high-powered Game Boy. But unfortunately, Virtual Boy launched, like I said, in summer of 1995, and it launched basically a month after Sega Saturn, which was also about 6 or 7 months after the PlayStation debuted in Japan. So if you look at this, and they want you to spend $250 on this, or you could spend $299, very famously, on PlayStation. I mean, what are you going to go for? Like this kind of simulated 3D, which is really just like, Game Boy with fancy effects, or actual, honest to God, Battle Arena Toshinden and Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer! I mean, that's still, resonates in the collective consciousness. So the timing was really bad. But another big problem was that the technology, even though it was very kind of out there and very impressive, it still wasn't quite where it needed to be. As you see, it's monochromatic. It just projected red against black, which did create a very sort of vivid, immersive viewpoint. But it wasn't as convincing as a full color RGB would have been. And I think the LED tech for full RGB color came along shortly after Virtual Boy debuted, but at the time it was just not affordable, not feasible. At the same time, the processor that powered it was a 20 megahertz NEC V810, which may not mean much to you, but it had previously been seen in a console released only in Japan called the PCFX, which was not a 3D-driven console. It was a failure because it was not a system about 3D when everyone else was going 3D. It was about, here's a system that can create really beautiful, basically anime cutscenes, like hand-drawn graphics, which, those games look great, but that was not the trend at the time. So, this technology shuffled from one failed system to another, basically. Very sad.
I did not realize it was the same process.
It is essentially the same
Virtual Boy has a very disappointingly low amount of FMV anime games.
Well, there's always Virtual Lab to kind of get you in that mood.
Oh boy.
Another problem with Virtual Boy is that the tech came up against a lot of regulatory issues. There was something called the Product Liability Act of 1995, which apparently made Nintendo very cautious about causing damage to children's eyes. Kids who are under the age of 10, their eyes and their brains are still developing, and having a device that burns images onto your retina and tricks your brain into thinking you're looking at 3D is maybe not good for developing eyes and minds. Also, there were concerns from the FCC that the chip inside the headset would emit radiation. So Nintendo had to shield the chip with, like a metal, basically a metal shield to prevent your brain from getting fried by it. So it went from what was supposed to be a wearable headset that would have been, like immersive 3D, to a device that had to sit on a tabletop, and you stick your face into it, and it had to, run on, I think, 4 or 6 AA batteries at a time, and weighed a ton. You couldn't really take it with you places. It wasn't a portable system, even though it was called Virtual Boy, which suggested like, hey, this is the next Game Boy, but like you're not gonna use this thing on a car trip. That's ridiculous. So it didn't turn out the way that it was supposed to. And I think, by all accounts, Nintendo knew that it was going kind of off the mark before it launched. And apparently Gunpei Yokoi really was disappointed. I think they compared it to, the story of the frog that you put into a pot of water and turn up the temperature a degree at a time. And the frog doesn't notice that it's boiling to death until it's dead. But, you know, it's just like this kind of gradual process where things get worse and worse, and there's no point at which you're like, oh, whoa, this is bad. It's just, you know, all of a sudden you're there, and there's nothing you can do about it. So Nintendo kind of just, I think, went with the sunk cost fallacy and said, we've sunk so much money into this, we need to just, you know, break even on it if we possibly can, make back whatever money we can. So they came up with a marketing scheme, just terrible packaging. It's like neon blue, neon red, hurts to look at, really ugly, very much of the 90s. They did what they could to promote it in Nintendo Power, but they just couldn't convince people to buy it. And so by the end of 1995, Nintendo actually discontinued it in Japan. All those really rare games that were only released in Japan are really rare because they basically were rushed out the door as quickly as possible in low quantities, some of them before they were finished, just to get them done and Nintendo could, you know, shut down the assembly lines. And the system kind of limped along in America into 1996, but, you know, those games from 1996 are no great shakes. And, you know, by the time we hit mid-1996 and E3, it was, you know, they you know, drew a line through it and said, this is it, it's over. So less than a year of life. That's not typical for Nintendo. I mean, you saw what happened with 3DS, but it had a kind of a soft launch. Nintendo said, wait, we can't afford for this to die. So they cut the price. They gave out the ambassador games. They said, we're really putting, you know, all of our chips into this. We're going to make it good. And they delivered. It was great. But they didn't give Virtual Boy that chance. And I think that's, you know, in large part because what else happened in 1996? Nintendo released Nintendo 64, which was real 3D and was not monochromatic and was a much more successful and much more popular system. So Virtual Boy was just, you know, interesting ideas at the wrong time with the wrong tech, and all the positive software support could not turn that around. They couldn't write that ship.
Yeah, there were, at least in Japan, there were a couple of games that even got so far as getting previews in Famitsu that were just aborted, as far as I can tell. Screenshots of them and everything that just never came out.
There's a whole site out there called Planet Virtual Boy that has done a great job of documenting all the games that were announced for Virtual Boy and never actually happened. And some of these games actually made it so far into development that their ROMs have leaked and you can be downloaded, and if you know where to sniff around on the internet, you can play them. And they are basically complete, they are playable. I think the big one is Bound High, which was kind of followed up with a Game Boy game with kind of starring the same character called Chalvo 55 that only shipped in Japan. But it's a kind of a top-down platformer, and it really makes great use of the Virtual Boy's scaling technology and 3D technology by essentially centering your character, a bouncing ball, in the middle of the screen, and then the world zooms in and out as you jump around. And so you have to kind of target yourself onto these platforms and move around and hit enemies, bounce off enemies. And it's a very, very impressive, very immersive game. And I don't think it would have turned around the Virtual Boy's fortunes if it had actually shipped. But it's cool, and it's a shame that it never shipped, and it's nice that someone actually launched it. This, believe it or not, is a Shin Megami Tensei game. I know you're looking at this and thinking, ah yes, demon negotiation, role-playing design, but
The demon negotiation involves shooting them in this game.
right, it's a one-way negotiation. This was actually the first Megatin game ever released in America, which is a weird little footnote of history. It's called Jack Brothers. Brian mentioned it earlier. It is a corridor shooter, twin stick, kind of like Robotron, and you play as either Jack Frost or
Pyro Jack or Jack-o'-lantern and Jack the Ripper.
Right. And you can also play as the fairy, who is basically your navvy, who gives you info. But you move through these levels, blowing up enemies that you will recognize. There's like Nekomata, and I don't even remember, like,
It's not like the
Ogre
whole
or-
roster even close, but yeah, there are a handful of them. Mostly it's the kind of the more intro demons that you get, within the first couple hours of any given Shin Megami Tensei.
I think it's all
game.
fairy typed for the most part.
Yeah, that might be true. Yeah.
It's interesting because no one in America knew what this game was about when it came out. They were like Jack Brothers. It has this terrible cover. It's like airbrushed and it
it's
looks really
horrible.
grotesque. Whereas in Japan, you got Hee-Ho, Jack Frost, the cute mascot character on the cover. They turned him into like basically
They're like
Jason.
Mudmen or something.
Yeah, it's
one of them is a Mudman on the cover. It's
Just unbelievable.
baffling.
So there was no indication like, hey, this is tied to one of the greatest role-playing franchises of all time. It was just like, hey, here's a game that you've never heard of from Virtual Boy, and now it sells for $1,000 because no one bought it, because no one wanted it, because why would they? But upon this really weird foundation, maybe despite this really weird foundation, Shin Megami Tensei has become pretty big in America, and SMT5 is coming out. I guarantee it has almost nothing whatsoever to do with Jack Brothers. This, of course, is Wario Land, Virtual Boy Wario Land, probably the best game on the system, and really a fascinating kind of midpoint between the original Wario Land and Wario Land 2, both of which were Game Boy games. This is like a Game Boy size sprite here, but then, that's Wario running through the background because, of course, there's the 3D effect. Normally, when he's running in the foreground, he's huge. Look at that gigantic sprite. He's so angry, and he shoots things out of his hat.
Except when he shrinks. Well, maybe
He's still angry, but
but
yes. You can't tell.
He's
But
a Mohawk.
he's as emotive as he can be with that many pixels. But this is really kind of one of the crowning achievements of the system. A game with only 16 levels. It's a challenge to find all the hidden treasures, because Wario's greedy. And you can go back and forth through the worlds. There's elevators at the end of each stage after you beat the boss, or maybe there's not even a boss at the end of some stages. But you can go back into those elevators and return to previous stages. So it has kind of this sort of persistence, though it's definitely not a Metroidvania game. But there's, kind of all the gimmicks and weirdness that you expect from a Wario game. Getting stuck in currents, there we go, trying to avoid spikes and so forth. Yeah, good stuff.
I think it might have been, on average, the best scored Virtual Boy game by Famitsu, too. It got like 5877, which is for kind of 6 and 7 is where most of the Virtual Boy's library
Someone
lived.
gave this game a
Famitsu.
5?
Someone, I don't
want to know
remember
who that is,
exactly
so
what they said.
I tell them I hate
I
them.
can get that information for you if you want to track them down.
Yes, please. It's time to cancel them.
I'm sure they're not working for
Yeah,
Famitsu
right.
anymore at this
You wrote
point.
you were going to dig up a 25-year-old review and go after someone. That's the internet way. But yeah, there were some pretty interesting games on Virtual Boy. I have had this loop kind of running in the background, this feed. I kind of skipped over some of the stuff like Teleroboxer, which was basically Punch-Out, except that it wasn't the Punch-Out team that worked on it. So instead of actually being called Punch-Out, it's kind of like ARMS, where it's like, oh, this is obviously something made in the Punch-Out name, but it wasn't the Punch-Out team, so they called it something different. But it's definitely Punch-Out, and you're beating up robots. And we haven't really talked about the Virtual Boy's controller, but
That's true.
that was a big part of the Teleroboxer experience.
Maybe more than anything else I can think of. Because you were actually controlling each of the arms individually, right? With the two sides of the controller.
Yeah, let me dig up the photos of the controller.
Yeah, you do have two D-pads on there, as you're about to see, and basically one D-pad on each side and the buttons on each side were controls for like left and right arms. So it seems easy, like on paper it seems easy enough to wrap your mind around. In reality, I feel like it's actually pretty hard when you have to execute on it, because I think different buttons do even different types of punches or something. Like I think you might have had like a specific button for uppercuts or a directional combination or something.
Yeah, so this is actually better than showing off the real thing because it's really big. But you can see the very strange controller that, aside from the lack of analog inputs on it, kind of feels like what people would be doing with their game controllers 3 or 4 years later for 3D systems. It had 2 D-pads, and now you've got like a D-pad and 2 analog controllers. But there were a few games that actually made use of both D-pads in in the way that, you know, we kind of think of twin stick games these days. I mean, Jack Brothers was a twin stick game, but like Red Alarm made use of the right stick basically to control the camera, which no one was doing that in 1995, and somehow T&E Soft, the people behind Highline and a bunch of golf games, were like, you know, we've got this other stick over, this other D-pad over here, that should control the camera. And now, you know, Halo came along and like everyone was, oh yes, way to go Bungie, what a great idea you came up with. So there are some really interesting little nuggets of history kind of buried in the Virtual Boy if you go looking for them. And some of those are very dead end, and some of them were good ideas that would be developed later, but on better systems, more appealing games, things people actually played, such as Halo. But innovation was happening here, and this is a really interesting little kind of dead end of video game design and thought that it kind of feels like the rest of the games industry took a couple of years to sort of catch up to what Nintendo and its partners were doing. But that is one of the kind of the benefits of this being a Nintendo system, is that, you know, this was Nintendo still riding pretty high after the Super NES era and doing pretty well for itself. And so lots of third parties were like, well, this thing looks weird. We don't know exactly what to do with it, but it's Nintendo, so obviously it's going to be successful. So we should hitch our wagon to this and, you know, make some games from Virtual Boy. So you have a bunch of Nintendo games for the system, but you also have a lot of third-party games. All right, this is one of the most interesting games. I love this game. I apologize if the screen, the video here makes you throw up or something, because it is better to play this than to watch, but it's a first-person shooter on Virtual Boy called Innsmouth no Yakata, which is based on the lore of H.P. Lovecraft. I think it's a tie-in of some sort to a movie that was released in Japan around this time. Yeah. And you travel through the mansion of Innsmouth with a gun with very little ammo. It's kind of survival horror-ish, moving a step at a time, bumping into walls, and occasionally being accosted by horrible monsters that have giant mouths in their stomach.
Which appear randomly. So it's very much a game about, am I going to get a good run or a bad run, and there's literally nothing you can do to influence which one you will end up with. And killing a monster takes about 8 shots, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, some of the monsters at the end just soak up ammunition. You don't have a lot of ammunition with you. But as you saw, there was that kind of map screen. So this has sort of a, like, you know, like Darius or Bubble Bobble, you know, Puzzle Bobble, all those the games by Taito where you would finish and you could go to a different level. Basically, your performance in each stage affected which level you would go to after. If you can go all the way on the top route by basically playing flawlessly, which is really hard because everything is randomized and you don't know what's going to happen, you get the best ending. Otherwise, you go, you know, down toward the lower paths and you get horrible endings, which you would expect from a Lovecraft-based game. But this is a really interesting game, very experimental, makes use of both D-pads as you would expect. It's not a smooth first-person scroller, smooth scrolling first-person shooter like Doom. It is very like step-by-step and travels into a golf course apparently.
The twist.
Surprise! H.P. Lovecraft is now he's now designing golf courses. But yeah, it's a really fascinating game. It feels like it's based on, kind of built around games like Silent Debuggers, you know, and that sort of thing from sort of like the PC Engine, TurboGrafx, Genesis. I guess Electro Cop would be another example. But at the same time, it has this random element to it, and every level clears really quickly. So you can do a full run through this game in like 20 minutes, but you have to collect a white key and a black key in each room, or in each level, and you have to find the door, and you have to avoid enemies, and you have to find like ammunition and health power-ups. So depending on just kind of how the game rolls for you, it can be kind of smooth sailing and you can have really good luck, or you can have a horrible, horrible time.
And at the end of it, you can't run past those monsters.
No. If a monster appears, you pretty much have to kill it or find another path, which is not that easy to do. And the later levels get really complicated. It is a really interesting game. I don't know that it's great or even necessarily good, but it's really fascinating and really unique. And again, one of the mini games that are trapped on Virtual Boy and needs to be kind of resurfaced for the rest of the world to enjoy.
Who even has that license now, though? I mean,
Lovecraft? I mean, that's public domain. Yeah, I don't think the companies that made Innsmouth no Yakuta are still around, so
Probably not.
who even knows? But I'd love to see games like that just resurrected in some capacity, even if it's like a PS5 collection that totally misses the point. Whatever. But even some of the games that are kind of mundane, like you can play golf on any system, but this is a golf game by T&E Soft, who I mentioned earlier. They made Highlight, but they also made a lot of really good golf games for PCs, and this actually has like a 3D kind of environment that you're moving through and golfing through, and is actually pretty convincing. It's a really solid golf game. I don't know that anyone wants to play golf by sticking their face into a Virtual Boy for 15 minutes at a time. But, the option is there, and at least if you do go to those lengths, you will not have a miserable time with it. I mean, at least not from the game itself.
So let me pose a question to you. V-Tetris or 3D Tetris?
Oh, by far V-Tetris. 3D
Okay,
Tetris
good.
isn't even Tetris. So there were, weirdly, 2 Tetris games released for Virtual Boy, one in each region. 3D Tetris was released in America as the final game for Virtual Boy. And it's not actually Tetris. And then V-Tetris was released pretty much at launch in Japan, but only in Japan. And this is actually licensed by the Tetris company and Bulletproof software and all of that. And it's interesting kind of mechanic to make use of the Virtual Boy's technology is that it has basically the Tetris blocks are falling on a cylinder, and you can rotate the cylinder. And when you clear away lines, it only has to be the line that you see at the front of the cylinder. So you have to kind of manage what's sort of hidden and behind the main screen and the space that you're playing, while at the same time trying to clear away lines and build combos. It takes a little while to wrap your head around, but it's an interesting twist, literally, on Tetris that has never been seen in any other version of Tetris.
And this system in general just had kind of a glut of puzzle games, really. Like, if you look at the titles just broken down by genre, like, I think puzzle games are the majority of them.
Yeah, there's a Bomberman puzzle game that we saw earlier called Panic Bomber that's basically like, Puyo Puyo along those lines.
Yeah.
And, kind of the big gimmick, because it's Bomberman, is that sometimes you drop bombs and you can stack those up and detonate a whole bunch of blocks. There's also one, I think, oh yes, the next game we'll see is a terrible puzzle game called Virtual Lab. There are a few others. I mentioned, let's see, Mario Clash earlier. It's not a puzzle game, but it's basically Mario Brothers, but there's kind of like an almost puzzle element to the environment because you're moving into and out of the background and you have to throw turtle shells across the layers in order to take out turtles.
It is a pretty neat version of it. Before this leaves the screen, I think we need to camp out on this game for just a second.
Okay.
From what I could find, I did not find every single reviews for every single Virtual Boy release game in Famitsu, but from what I can find, this is the worst scoring Virtual Boy game.
Really?
Yes. Even worse than Virtual Lab, but just barely. This one got 5.344, and it's exactly for the reasons you would expect. Why Virtual Boy? Like, why this doesn't add anything of... I mean, you're not seeing it here, what they have specifically for Virtual Boy, but they have kind of a 3D, like, tilted mode in the game.
I should have shown that instead of just the straight version of the
I don't know if they just... and I don't think it's that they didn't know about that mode. I think they just felt it wasn't enough to make it a worthwhile release, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, there were many other versions of Space Invaders that didn't give you headaches. So I can see the problem there. All right, this is maybe the most infamous game on Virtual Boy. It's called Virtual Lab. And it was released incomplete. That's not just conjecture. Thankfully, a website called Bad Game Hall of Fame recently conducted an interview with the developer, and by developer I mean the individual human being, the one person who developed this game under the name Nakoti, and they basically said, yeah, like our company was kind of mismanaged and made a lot of bad choices, and we just had to rush this out as quickly as possible. So this this is a really inexplicable game where you are taking, I guess, lengths of intestine, and it's, call it Inhuman Centipede. You're like linking these intestines together to make them vanish. Meanwhile, there's this girl over on the side who's, I guess, cheering you on, and you might look at the image there and think, wow, her chest is heaving. And yes, that does take advantage of the 3D effects of the system. The one space, aside from like the stars in the background, that actually does. But something that was really interesting that came out of that interview with the Coty is that you look at this character and think, well, that's kind of skeevy. But actually, the designer, who goes by the alias Megumi, created this character kind of as a representation of themselves. And so that kind of changes a little bit. It adds like a little bit of a wistful note, I think, to this really, really bad unfinished game. Anyway, I've heard that they only made like 100 copies of this game. I don't know if that's true, but I would believe it because even when this game was first released, you can go back and look at import shop archives for like ncsx.com. And it was just vanishingly rare at the very beginning. Thankfully, a friend of Retronauts, Chris Kohler, allowed me to photograph his copy, and I never have to touch it again. This is another of the super rare games, SD Gundam Dimension War.
Your favorite series?
I've come around to like Gundam since playing this game, not because of this game, actually, but I understand it better now and understand like all the really dumb things this game does that don't line up with the franchise's lore, like the white base blowing up a Zanzibar, just like that. Right. Come on!
SD Gundam has never really cared about going according to canon very much.
But this is a strategy game on Virtual Boy. I know everyone was just dying to shove their face into a strategy game for 15 minutes at a time and try to calculate their moves within a space before they got a headache. Well, here's your opportunity, SD Gundam Dimension War. This has been, as you see, there's English text here. This is a fan translation, so you can play it in English if for some reason you are possessed by that desire. A few other games I've mentioned. Virtual Bowling. There are 2 bowling games on the system. One is Virtual Bowling, released only in Japan. Actually, really, really good. A real shame it's not on any other system because it is a damn fine bowling simulation. There's also Nestor's Funky Bowling, which was released only in the US. Stars the comic character Nestor from Nintendo Power and his never-before-seen twin sister Hester, and it's not very good. It's actually a surprisingly bad virtual bowling simulation. So we kind of lost out there. We got the bad Tetris and the bad bowling game. No fair.
But we did get Vertical Force.
We did, but that was also in Japan. We did get Waterworld, which is based on the blockbuster smash film by Kevin Costner. Actually, not a terrible game, despite what you may think. Not good, but it's kind of got a Defender thing going on.
That's true.
A little bit asteroids. I don't know. It's hard to describe. You're trying to rescue people who are floating in the water while killing the smokers who are on their jet skis trying to abduct the humans who are floating in the water. Bad, but it has a good soundtrack. It's very like melancholy and actually kind of really reinforces the sensation of sadness you feel playing the game. Anyway, I think we have like 5 minutes left. Is that about right?
Correct.
Okay, so if anyone wants to like weigh in on Virtual Boy, please, by all means, raise your hand and Josh will bring you the mic.
So I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I think one that I really wanted to highlight was one great way of playing Virtual Boy games today is, it's harder now because 3D TVs aren't much of a thing anymore, but if you take an emulator and you run it on a 3D TV, you can get a pretty good experience for the Virtual Boy. Now it's not quite the same thing as putting your face into it because that creates the immersion aspect of it, which your average person didn't experience until things like Beat Saber, right? Where it's like now you're cut off from the world. And I always thought that was a very unique aspect of the Virtual Boy, right? You were in this world, and Mario kind of did a great job of that. But it's really too bad we don't see more people talking about the great emulation opportunities here because I think it's better than than cutting up to a Virtual Boy and hooking up to a television where you only get one side of it. Get a 3D TV, get an emulated new 3D, and play it that way.
I agree. And Nintendo, when they launched the 3DS, briefly tried to rehabilitate the Virtual Boy's reputation. They were like, oh, this was a thing we did. But they never actually went as far as saying, here are the games that we made for it, and you can play them. So it feels kind of half-hearted. I think there was a question up here. No.
Yeah. So I watched Virtual Boy Works, and I emulated some of the games myself. I hadn't actually stuck my face into a Virtual Boy until last night on the floor, and I was kind of blown away with the 3D effect. And hearing you talk about the scaling array and everything, I was just wondering, like, we've seen a lot of like screens that try to do 3D in that, but has that technology been used for anything else since the Virtual Boy, like inside or outside of gaming?
I don't know that it has, but I feel like it doesn't need to have been used because other forms of 3D visualization have improved. And so, like, this is, the technology inside Virtual Boy is kind of the equivalent of when you look at like an LED alarm clock on your bedside stand and you kind of shake it and you get like that after image. Like, that's the entire basis of the technology, and it's a little painful to the eye over an extended period of time. It's, beaming light at you. Like, this does not capture the luminosity of Virtual Boy. Like, it's so bright and vivid against the black background, kind of like Vectrex or Asteroids. Yeah, it's like some of those old vector games. So you kind of lose out on that, which is a shame. But yeah, I think there are better ways to do 3D now. So I don't think they need to do that. But I think there was a question up here in front, or a comment.
Yeah, this will be the last one.
I think games for Virtual Boy may have led to the decline of Blockbuster.
There's the.
Do you think Virtual Boy may have led to the decline of Blockbuster, or maybe Blockbuster led to the decline?
I think
Why is it so
Blockbuster
damn expensive to
survived.
get one of those hard cases?
Right. I think Blockbuster survived pretty well after the Virtual Boy died. I think other things were responsible for that, like Netflix and mail CD or DVD. But I'm sure that Blockbuster's buyers were like, why do we buy so many Virtual Boys? I don't know. What do you think?
I'm sure they did have a fair amount of regret, but yeah, ultimately I can't believe that it made too much of a dent in them, because that was maybe not the height of their power as a company, but pretty close to it, right? So probably it dinged them a little bit, and that was it. They just moved on with life.
All right, so that is it for this presentation. It's already been 15 minutes, unbelievably. But I did want to end on one little note. There are lots of fans keeping Virtual Boy alive. I mentioned things like, the VB consoleizer and games that have been salvaged from leaked ROMs. But people are also homebrewing some games. Most of them aren't great. I don't think the technology is really there yet. But then you have something like Hyper Fighting, where someone basically took the Super NES version of Street Fighter 2 and released it in, I think they released like 60 carts, so this thing sells for thousands of dollars if you can find one, even though it's not an official release. But I mean, it's a really impressive Street Fighter, recreation with a really great what do you call those? The depth effects. Parallax effects, yes. So that's really impressive, and then you have people like our friend Binge Edwards, who has made controllers for Virtual Boy and has actually created a stick specifically to play Hyper Fighting. So if you want a really specific controller use case, a controller made for a fan game on Virtual Boy that exists in quantities of a few dozen. Like, that's it. That is kind of the pinnacle of it. But it exists, and there is this passionate fan base that understands the appeal of Virtual Boy and loves it. Like the few of you out here who raised your hand. So I would say, play Virtual Boy if you can. Spread the gospel. Enjoy. Take a break every 15 minutes. And you can buy Virtual Boy Works at limitedrungames.com while quantities last, and we will have to do a reprint.
Let's hear it for Virtual Box, ladies and gentlemen.
And that's it. That's the end of another informative panel from the Midwest Gaming Classic Library. I'd like to thank both Jeremy Parish and Brian Clark for being at the 2021 Midwest Gaming Classic talking about the subject of the Virtual Boy. Now, speaking personally about the Virtual Boy, I never had one. I didn't buy into it. Much like Brian Clark, I went somewhere like a Toys R Us or a Babbage's or Software Etc., Funko Land, whatever was around at the time. I went there, I tried it out, I was not impressed. I looked at it as a oversized Game Boy, which the graphics are pretty close to that. The later Game Boy games, the graphics were pretty close together between the Game Boy and the Virtual Boy. And I wasn't impressed with the color palette. I wasn't really impressed too much with the games selection. So I decided not to buy it. And I think I probably bought, what came out around that time? I believe, was it the Sega CD? Could have been, I don't know. The 90s are a blur for me a little bit. I mean, I remember a lot. But when it came to the video games, I do remember I did own, I had a regular NES, I had a Genesis, I had a Sega CD, TurboGrafx. I did not get the Neo Geo because that thing was hugely overpriced. And the Virtual Boy I was interested in, but was, I was not impressed with. So I passed on it, much like Brian Clark. Going back to Jeremy Parish and Retronauts, please look them up on the internet. You will not be disappointed with what they talk about in the podcast. And go to Limited Run Games to pick up a book or two by Jeremy Parish on the NES, Virtual Boy, and the Super Nintendo Entertainment Systems. And until next time, thank you for watching. Take care, stay safe, and game on.
When you decide to come out to this type of function, this type of experience, this type of gathering, Marvel phenomenon, there is only one event to attend, the Midwest Gaming Classic, where you and the games are one. Midwest Gaming Classic. It's not just child's play.